If you knew the ordinary life I live, you wouldn't recognise in that profile. I'll tell you. Thank you very much anyway. Must be my extraordinary life here. My 1 week a year. Oh dear. Yes, I did read your profiles last night, and I was utterly terrified. I actually felt that I've got to leave. I must go away. I can't face these people. But I thought, can I sneak off in the middle of the night without anyone noticing? And when I read them, I thought, dear me, I'm just terrified of you. All the things that you do and you're connected with and so on and that, basically I have to say none of which I really know anything about. Well, not really. I don't know anything about, which will probably shock you. And I mentioned this to Stefan just now, and he said, well, never mind, just carry on as normal. So that's what I'm going to do. We are, for the first time ever, being videoed. It's a static video. I've agreed to do this because I'm getting old, and everyone's in shock because Brian Goodwin's just died. So it's occurred to them, I think, that probably I'm going to die soon anyway, because I'm in my 70s. And so, you know, they thought, get him on video while we can. It may be your last chance, you never know. So there's that as well. So this means I've got to try to behave myself this year. I've got to be careful what I say. And, oh, dear me, I've got to be a good boy, in other words. So, no, I will try to put aside the fact that I'm terrified of you, and I'm really concerned as to how on earth what I do will turn out to be of interest to you. So if you find it boring, just go to sleep for a bit and don't come in for other sessions. That's all right. Please don't boo. Right? It puts me off. I'm going to begin in a gentle way. At least I think it's fairly gentle. I've written a book. Well, I have written a book except for the last chapter. And you think, oh, that's easy, home and dry now, last chapter. But not a bit of it. It turns out the last chapter, as with every other chapter, is causing me a great deal of difficulty. And namely, I don't understand what it's about. This is surprising because you think, having written a book in the last chapter, you'd know what it was about. But it just turns out that apparently I don't know what it's about. And I'm sort of now trying to learn what it is I'm supposed to... There must be something I have to understand or something I have to see, which I haven't yet seen. Since I've been working on this book for many years, this is, again, another surprise. I got a feeling in the back of my mind, you know the duck-rabbit figure? Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've been writing a duck, and it turns out I might have been writing a rabbit. So that's where I am at the moment. But most of it is finished in its final form. I've got the title. The title is The Dynamics of Being. And I change the subtitle at the present moment because I'm in a state of flux and chaos and panic more or less every day, or actually more or less every middle of the night between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And when I wake up the next morning, my wife wakes up the next morning, the first thing she gets is, I've got another subtitle. She's very good. She discovers it immediately in bed when she's half asleep. The subtitle is... Actually, last week this has been happening every day. Anyway, today the subtitle is Discovering the Wholeness of Lived Experience. That's the subtitle. Good, she likes that. I might stick with that. I don't know. Anyway, there we are. And I've been working on this for longer than I care to think, and it's always the same with books. If I'd have known how much trouble it was going to cause me, I would never have started. But then you don't, it's like life, you don't know just as well. So I'm going to start because I've done this before. It does seem to have some impact, and it enables me to pick up other things as I go along. Just in the first chapter, I'm going to read this first chapter, first bit, then another bit later. Partly because for years I never did read anything at all. But I do now because I put a lot of effort into this, so I might as well reap some benefit from my own work. Later on we'll be doing something which Stefan said, you have to listen to it's in the language, not so much the first part, which I had a lot of trouble starting this book, which is why it took me so long. In fact, I actually began it 3 times, and each time I got to about page 90, page 100, once to page 120, and then discovered that no, this isn't the book I wanted to write. I didn't know what the book was that I wanted to write, but I knew that the book I was writing wasn't the book I wanted to write. So that went into a drawer. And this took a few years, and I still haven't started this book. And then it occurred to me, I don't know how, well, why don't you just write about how this happened to you? Well, I'm English, so you don't like referring to yourself. It's quite difficult. I'm getting more used to it as I've got older, but English people, particularly men, don't talk about themselves. And so this was very difficult for me to write it in a slightly autobiographical way. But when I did, it actually worked. And I then began to understand what it was that I was doing and what I'd wanted to do all along. So that's my excuse for giving you this slight autobiographical introduction. After that's over, the rest of the book gets into the real thing and there's no more. Well, there's a few bits of autobiographical, it's true. But I think it's, God, my wife says I'm becoming humanized. So there we are. But it's written in such a way that if you follow the movement of the language, that takes you into the movement of the thinking. That's later on. Okay, the first chapter is called Into the Dynamic Way of Thinking. Introduction. This is a book about another way of thinking. The dynamic way of thinking, which is the general name I'm going to give it, first appears in European philosophy at the beginning of the 19th century. Here, as always, it takes a form that is specific to the particular circumstances in which it appears. Confusing the container with the content, as we so often do, means that inevitably we end up focusing too much attention on the specific form which this thinking takes in a particular instance, and consequently fail to see the more universal content, which is the movement of thinking itself. The dynamic way of thinking appears again in European philosophy in the first part of the 20th century. But once again, we are too easily seduced by the specifics of the occasion to notice the more universal element. Later in the 20th century, it comes up again in yet another context, this time in the history and philosophy of science. Instead of the philosophy of idealism and the Romantic movement, early 19th century, or the philosophy of phenomenology and hermeneutics, early 20th century. But divergent as these philosophical movements may seem outwardly, and they are divergent, they nevertheless belong together when they are seen in terms of the movement of thinking which each expresses in its own different way. The significance of this dynamic way of understanding so easily gets lost in the obfuscations of philosophers who, in their endless attempts to justify what they are doing, all too often succeed only in covering it over with a dense layer of what to others seems to be just impenetrable jargon. The vision gets lost, and what is left descends into an intellectual exercise, which turns round upon itself endlessly until it ceases to be of interest to any but a few. This is such a pity, because there is something here which is potentially of much wider interest, and which needs to be brought out. I believe this can be done by taking a more concrete approach. This is what I want to try to do here. And for this reason, I'm going to begin by going back to my own first encounters with the dynamic way of thinking. So one of the themes I'm picking up here, announcing at the beginning, which goes as a leitmotif through the book, but is never done hopefully in a heavy way, is that there's a whole stream of philosophical thinking in Europe which has actually been misunderstood or not really taken up as what its really important value is. And it actually is a holistic stream, which is very, very important indeed. This is becoming noticed more and more today, but it's only slowly so. Anyway, we'll worry about that. My introduction to European philosophy came through an unusual route. I had been working in a small research group, investigating more effective ways of communicating ideas in education. At the time, the late 1960s and early 70s, so that puts me in my place, it goes back even worse later, there was a growing interest in the UK in management education and organisational development. The kind of methods for more effective communication which we were researching turned out to be also of interest here. In fact, more so than in mainstream education, where institutional constraints sometimes made innovation difficult. I'm writing, I'm being nice here, I'm trying to be nice. I would have actually said always makes everything difficult, but you know, I've been trying to be nice. I don't want to put anybody off. This was at the time when systems theory, in quotes, capital S, capital T, systems theory was very much in vogue in the world of management and organisation. This is the 60s and 70s. Diagrams were much in evidence, usually consisting of words in boxes joined together by lines to represent connections. The aim of systems thinking was to move away from the emphasis on the idea of basic building blocks towards the idea of the overall order of the organisational form. In the eyes of various theorists, especially von Bertalanffy, it was believed this would lead to a general science of wholeness, which would be a universal science of education that would apply equally to all forms of organisation, irrespective of differences in kind, whether they be physical, chemical, organic, ecological, psychological, sociological, cultural or historical. So the general science of organisation, which would apply in all cases, irrespective of the particular kind. There's a word trying to come out there. Anyway, we'll leave it. It seemed to me that although the claim was made that systems thinking is holistic and therefore non-reductionistic, it is in fact much more reductionistic in practice than many of the optimistic pronouncements about it would lead us to suppose. There then follows a very long footnote. If any of you have looked at my book on Goethe, you'll see I tend to have often very long notes. Partly this is to fill people in on background and all sorts of things. And I also don't want all that to come into the main text to clutter it up, because I'd like a reader to be able to go through it, which they said, oh, blow those notes, I'm not going to look at it, and just go through and not be interrupted by it. So I'm not going to read this long footnote, but it is a long footnote on the first in the book, on systems theory. Now, by systems theory, I do not mean dynamical systems theory, i.e. the so-called very badly named chaos theory, complexity theory, and so on, non-linear dynamical systems, etc. I don't mean by systems theory that. I mean what was called general systems theory, which grew up in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and it really is another one of these developments which actually came from Central Europe. Von Bertalanffy came from there and introduced various ideas into America, which were picked up very energetically by people in the management world. And what the view was, you could treat all organisational wholes. There was a science of organisational wholes, which was quite independent of the particular kind of whole that it was, whether it was a physical one or a cultural one. And this was holistic. Now, I really felt that this was, I'm being polite here, I actually felt that this was profoundly untrue. And in fact, in this long note, which I'm not going to go into, it goes into it in some detail, and I knew people who said things that what I discovered was the remarks of von Bertalanffy, the founder of general systems theory, about what this was, and I suddenly realized that in fact it was a direct parallel of a remark made by Descartes about what his program was. And I've got the two quotes here side by side. And you can see that Descartes' program for what he called Mathesis Universalis, a universal mathematics, is identical to what general systems theory was about. But the general systems theory thought they were overcoming the reductionism Descartes, introducing a holistic point of view, and they were actually, what they're doing, and this is the point of the note, shows that what they do is they fulfill Descartes' program. And so instead of being going beyond Descartes, they actually fulfill Descartes. And in other words, the whole thing is a bit of a con. And very, very, very many people are being conned by it. And I've also got some nice quotes in from Ken Wilber. I think in his book, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, Ken Wilber deals with systems theory there in a way which is quite brilliant. And I say that because I've gone through all this myself. When I read it in Wilber, I thought he's actually hit the nail right on the head. And so there's some quotes from there, but we don't need to go into that now. Or at all. We can now continue. My main concern was with the claim that systems theory is the science of wholeness. This arose out of my experience as a postgraduate research student in physics at Birkbeck College early in the 1960s. So now I've gone back even 10 years further. I'm now right into the beginning of the 1960s. In fact, in those few marvellous years before the 60s happened, all this stuff they have about London in the 60s and so on, thankfully it didn't happen until about the end of 64, beginning of 65. So half the 60s were free of the 60s. It was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And we had a marvellous time in London before all that rubbish happened. And so far as I'm concerned, the worst musical group that ever existed was the Beatles. You haven't heard of them. You're too young for that.
Oh, no.
Yeah. This arose in my experience in the 1960s when I worked on the problem of wholeness in the quantum theory. That's what I was doing in Birkbeck College in the early 1960s. It had become clear that a fundamentally new way of thinking was needed for quantum physics. Of course, now so much has been said about quantum physics. It's coming out of our ears. I can't stand it any longer. I can't stand any reference to quantum physics anymore. I'm so fed up with hearing about quantum physics. I'm so fed up of seeing all the rubbish that's been said about it by people who are not physicists and don't know what they're talking about. I want to see this as a new foundation for a higher kind of understanding when it's not. And they don't, and there's so many different ways of interpreting quantum. So I'm not into quantum physics, so don't ask me a question. But I was into quantum physics in 1962, 63, 64. Is that 50 years ago or only 40? 40 and a bit years ago. I was big into quantum physics then. And also later, but it's gone ridiculous now, the claims that are made about it. It had become clear that a fundamentally new way of thinking was needed for quantum physics, even though such a possibility had been explicitly denied by Niels Bohr in what was referred to as the Copenhagen interpretation of the quantum theory, which had become the most widely accepted view among physicists as a result of Bohr's extraordinary persuasiveness. There's a lot being done on the social psychology of that now. But David Bohm believed this could be done. That is, that you could find new concepts of wholeness. He pointed to examples which he said could function as templates for a new way of thinking about wholeness. One of these was the hologram, which at the time in question was a technological innovation. I'm talking about the early 60s. The laser had only just been developed at the end of the 50s. Holograms were entirely new. This appealed to the imagination because, unlike a photographic plate, where each point of the image on the plate corresponds approximately to a point on the object, with a hologram, each part of the plate contains information about the whole object. Thus, instead of localized parts, with a hologram, the whole is present in each part, and each part is distributed throughout the whole. This means that the part and the whole are internally related, and therefore, through the whole which is present in each part, the parts themselves are internally related to each other. You cannot have separation into parts, in other words. To use the language which Bohm later adopted, 10 years later, the whole is enfolded in the part, and each part is enfolded in the whole. These ideas of Bohm's encourage some, but by no means all of us, to think that the wholeness of human organizations, at whatever level, could not be understood adequately by means of a systems approach, because something more holographic was needed. And again, there's another long footnote on the quantum thing. I won't go into that. This is the very early days. Bohm had just gone to Birkbeck College. It's the beginning of the 1960s. One of the areas in which we were working required the design of an attitude survey for the preliminary stage of gathering information prior to the introduction of an organizational change. This is in a big organization at the time, which is called Joe Lyons. Joe Lyons has more or less ceased to exist now, which actually would have been unthinkable at that time. They were very famous before the war, during the war, and after the war. It was a big, huge grocery firm on a giant scale, which had cafes and all sorts of things. And Joe Lyons was big. And they wanted to introduce a particular organizational change through the organization as a whole. And this was a remarkable one, because they wanted to introduce the computer. A lot of this work was about introducing computers as a management information tool, because this was what was happening at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s in Britain. Now, this is remarkable because Lyons had actually been the very first people ever to introduce a computer into business. And that was at the end of the 1940s, straight after the war. And they went to the people, the computers had been developed largely on account of Bletchley Park and breaking the Enigma code and the Lorentz code and so on and that. And you can still see that. I saw those computers there a couple of months ago. It's fantastic, actually. And you call it, fired it up. You fire up computers, do you? It sounded like it. Oh, electromagnetic things whirling round and so on. Anyway, Lyons said, we want a computer for business purposes, but they were thinking in terms of payroll. So they approached these people, these top mathematicians, Turing, etc., and they said, no, you don't understand. Computers have nothing to do with business. They're scientific, mathematical research tools. You've got the wrong idea, go away. Well, they didn't go away. What they actually did, it's an astonishing story, was people in their own staff built their own computer. And so they were actually the first business ever to have a computer. Now, as often happens, when you're first, you end up falling behind, because later developments happen, which are more advanced. People do those, but you haven't done those because you were there first. So they fell behind completely. And so then they wanted to introduce the computer as a management information tool. And the people in the organization were against it, because they had introduced the computer first. And they didn't understand the whole business of management information by computer. So our job was to help. We were brought in as consultants. A lot of you know about consultancy, don't you? People who come in from outside who don't know what they're talking about, pretend that they do, and they go around asking people lots of questions, then feed back the answers people have given to them in something called a report. It makes it look like you've done it. That's how it works, isn't it? Didn't take too long to work that out, did it? I see smiles of recognition everywhere. Didn't cross my mind that last night when I was reading your profiles, as any of you had ever done anything like that. Sorry. And so the question was that they wanted to do this, and they wanted an attitude survey throughout the whole organization on the attitude towards the computer. And then they wanted us to work on introducing, this is so mechanical, a holistic attitude change to the organisation. So they would then want the computer. Oh, God, honestly. Oh. We adopted the philosophy that each person in their role in an organisation is in fact an expression of the organisation as a whole. So we could say the whole organisation comes to expression to some degree through each person in that organisation in their functional role. So if the whole comes to expression through its parts, which will therefore each include reflections of all the others to some degree, that is, their internally related parts. The parts are not just externally related by causal connections, but the parts already in being parts are internally related because each part is itself an expression of the whole. So the whole is within the part, and therefore the parts must be internally related. In other words, the wholeness is already there. This is one of the things about wholeness. People try to make wholeness happen. Actually, what you have to see is the wholeness that's there already. It's ubiquitous. That's what you're overlooking. And then if you try to introduce wholeness, you superimpose a counterfeit wholeness on top of the wholeness that's already there. So you're in trouble. And this causes a great deal of aggravation and so on between people. But nobody understands why this is, because they don't see it in terms of the dynamics of the whole and the part. Oh, yes. I have to read that bit again. So if the whole comes to expression through its parts, which will therefore each include reflections of all the others to some degree, then the way to understand the whole is to go into the parts, instead of trying to stand back to get an overview to see how the parts could be made to fit together into a whole. The whole is coming to presence in each part. Then you go into the parts to discover the whole, not try to stand back and make the parts fit together to make a whole, which all too often seem to be the outcome of the systems approach. In practical terms, if the way into the whole is through the parts, each of which is an expression of the whole, instead of trying to get a total overview of the whole, then this meant talking to everyone in the organisation, because whoever they were, the whole was coming into expression through them, no matter how partially, and I like the word partially because I could hyphenate it and say partially. Encountering the whole in this way felt more like entering into another dimension of the organisation. It was a concrete dimension, more compared with the usual way of thinking. Our practical task, as we interpreted it, was to devise surveys and other materials which would facilitate this holographic approach to the wholeness of the organisation. So this is our basic model, which is based on the hologram. This is what we were working with. And it was different from the systems approach, where they had all these boxes with words in, and then made these lines, making these external connections. We were saying, no, those external connections are a superimposition. These things are already internally related to one another. There are no separate objects, as it were, separate entities. Actually, to be honest with you, in terms of, if people just took the trouble to go into European, this is continental European philosophy, of the last 200 years, they'd find this stuff there in spades. I mean, it starts with Hegel. There's no mystery to it, but just everyone ignores it. So there you are. One day, I was trying to describe the idea behind this work to Brian Lewis, who was Professor of Educational Systems at the Open University. Sure, Brian worked before he came here. Brian Lewis, this was when the Open University first started. And again, we were doing work for the Open University on assessment techniques. I was very much involved with that until I got to know Brian Lewis. He told me, when I talked to him about this, he told me that it sounded to him very similar to what is called the Hermeneutic Circle. And he suggested that I looked into the philosophy of hermeneutics. This is a word which people are not familiar with, but I did just that. He told me what to do. He said there is now for the first time ever, a readable book in English. So I got the readable book in English, and off we went. This philosophy arose in the first place in connection with questions about how we understand written works, whether they be scriptural, philosophical, literary, historical, or legal, or whatever. But it became apparent that hermeneutics applies more widely to all forms of expression, and hence to any kind of cultural expression, from the simplest to the most complex. Put simply, if somewhat abstractly, the hermeneutic circle arises from the circumstance that, in order to understand the whole, we must understand the parts. But in order to understand the parts, we must understand the whole. It became obvious immediately that the holographic approach to wholeness, with which it was intended to replace the systems approach, had a form which is very similar to that of the hermeneutic circle. And hence, that what we thought of as a holographic survey could equally well be thought of as a hermeneutic survey. This opened the door to the possibility that systems thinking could be replaced by hermeneutic thinking in the context of human organizations. There was an explosion of activity as we explored the hermeneutic dimension of the organization in as many ways as we could find, which included one occasion when I found myself giving a seminar on the hermeneutics of the organization to the somewhat bemused management of IBM. I said there was an explosion of activity. It certainly was an explosion. It really was. It certainly was for me. When I got into this and saw this, in fact, I didn't come down for 18 months. Partly it was also because I just had the first child, my daughter. I had also a fantastic experience at the birth. So everything came together, and I literally didn't come down for 18 months. I've never known such an energetic time in the whole of my life. And I just thought this hermeneutic approach, because what it meant was, you weren't just referring to a technological innovation, the hologram. There was a whole philosophical tradition of this philosophy. And you could say, well, you switched from systems thinking to hermeneutic thinking. And there's a whole new kind of thinking could be introduced here, with a whole background, and so I just found that just extraordinary. And I mustn't think about it anymore. Because I want to tell you something else. Now, this is where I get totally muddled up. That's all right. Now I come to my first deviation. This is you come down, and we start there, and we go down, 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 down. But as we're going down, 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 we go shoop, shoop, shoop. Right? So I'm now going to do this bit. Okay. There's a footnote here, which will bring me into some of the things you may have looked at already. Sorry. I have a permanently bad chest. It won't go away, so there's nothing that can be done about it. Sorry about it. I have to put up with it. You may have to put up with it too. An attempt was made to express the difference between this hermeneutic approach and the systems approach in a talk I gave in 1971 at a conference on developing the whole man. This was the 25th anniversary conference of the Institute for the Comparative Study of History, Philosophy and the Sciences. I had a fellowship there for some years. The conference was intended to be a platform for the launching of a new venture in adult education, the International Academy for Continuous Education. This was the inspiration of the founder and director of the aforementioned institute, the mathematician and philosopher J.G. Bennett. When he said to me, "You should give a talk," after one of the speakers had dropped out, I was taken aback. and told him I had no idea what to talk about. He went silent, as was his custom. And after a while he said, in the ex-cathedra manner, which was also his custom, "You should give a talk on the whole, counterfeit and authentic." Looking back now, I am astonished at how this encapsulated the struggle that had been going on in me at the time, and which he himself had put up with at times with remarkable patience. I mean, I was a right bloody nuisance, to put it mildly, because I was always niggling away at people, the systems. I mean, the thing was, I was working with these systems people, and the people who were running things with the systems people, and it got really bad, I mean, at times, you know, because I was opposing the very kind of thing that this whole thing was based upon. I was a nuisance. Somehow I managed to give the talk, and it was somehow as well, I managed to give the talk, and to my amazement and relief, it was well received. Encouraged by this, I wrote an extended version, and this was published in the House Journal of the Institute for the Comparative Study of History, Philosophy and Sciences. It's called Systematics, in September 1971. Years later, in the middle of the 1960s, I was persuaded by David Seaman to let it be republished in a book he was co-editing on environmental phenomenology. I said no, but I did it anyway. I always say no first. It's safest. Because this was very different from the original context in which the paper was written, I changed it by removing the second half of the paper, which had really been based on Heidegger, and substituting instead a new section on the whole and the part in Goethe's way of science, which had not been known to me when I wrote the original paper. This fitted surprisingly well. In fact, the two parts seemed to fit like hand and glove. And if you wonder why I'm talking about this, it's because that's the paper which I hope I don't discover now you haven't seen.
Oh, yes.
You have seen it? Because if you haven't seen it, I'm stuffed, aren't I?
No,
Yeah. Well, of course, the title's slightly different here. This is the one that Seaman was published in this book. And then you've got that, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone not got this? Good, I can go home now then. That's all right. And this was an attempt to sort of put these ideas together. And there's a lot in here which I don't come out explicitly saying it, but a lot of it was aimed at some of the people I was working with who were the heavy systems theorists. Because really, the beginning part is actually developing a theory of the whole and the part which is completely contrary to the systems theory. And my idea of the counterfeit whole that's the system. So it was quite awkward working with people who could see between the lines sort of what I was doing. But we were split into two groups. It was a terrible situation to be in, really. But that's what happens when things get creative and dynamic, isn't it? As I'm sure you know. Sorry. In fact, I hope you have managed to read something of this. Don't bother about the Goethe stuff at the end. As I say, the Goethe stuff was added later. But it wasn't there in the first part. The first part went further into the whole in terms of Heidegger. When Seaman asked for this in 1986, I think it was, thereabouts it was published. This was so long after I'd done this, published in 1971, and my life had changed completely. I'd gone through all sorts of things, and I was living an entirely different life. When he asked me, I spent 20 years teaching physics in a school. I wasn't doing these kind of things at all. That had all stopped rather suddenly in 1974 in catastrophic form, as it were, and I found myself in a school teaching physics, which I'd never intended to do, and which turned out I thoroughly loved. I liked physics, and I enjoyed teaching it. But I didn't want to know about all this stuff. That's why I said to Simon, no, I'm not doing that. Finished with all that. But he well, you know, if you say no to American, they always say, well, I'll take that as a yes then, so you don't get very far. Anyway, it got published with some changes and a fancy new subtitle about finding a means for dwelling in nature, which doesn't really have anything to do with that, but actually I put that in because that's the title of the book, so that I'll stick it in as a subtitle. It'll look like it fits the book. So that was it anyway. And then the book I eventually got put together, the big book I wrote, Wholeness of Nature. This was then put in as the first part. So I changed the title again. I decided I'd call it Authentic and Counterfeit Wholes this time, which actually seemed better to me because I thought authentic ought to come before counterfeit, and so that's it. Now, there's a lot in the first few pages, even though I say it myself. There's a lot compressed in there, and it does give a new way of approaching the whole and the part, in which it emphasizes the reciprocal relationship of the whole and the part. This, looking back now, and this was really at the time, see what happened was, whenever you have the system, then the whole becomes dominant, and everything becomes determined by the whole. And I found this very, it leads to a form of totalism, and it actually leads to, politically, it leads to totalitarianism in whichever form it actually it comes. And I was very upset by all of this. I cared a great deal, because also I just had a daughter, and I became incredibly sensitive to what was going on in the world. And this whole approach, which masqueraded as wholeness, was actually a form of totalitarianism. That's what it was. And I was working with people who were totalitarianists but didn't realize it. And so that's why in this, if you read it carefully, the emphasis is on the reciprocation of the whole and the part. Neither is dominant. The whole depends on the parts, and the parts depend on the whole. The whole comes to presence in the parts, and the parts are the place for the presencing of the whole. You can't have a dominant whole, because the whole never becomes present as an object. It never comes out. You can't put your finger on it. You can't say, here is this, there is that. Oh, look, there's the whole there. It's not an object. It comes to presence within things, which are therefore the parts to which the whole presence is. And it therefore depends on the parts in order to be whole. As indeed the parts depend on the whole to be parts, in other words, to be significant, instead of just nothing very much. That when you get into this is the dynamics of the whole and the part. And one needs to take this dynamical picture. Well, nobody does. They've now got these stupid phrases, top down instead of bottom up. What a load of rubbish. We don't want top down, just as we don't want bottom up. Everyone said we don't want bottom up, because that's reductionist. We take all the parts and stick them together and make whole. We don't want that. So I know, let's go top down the other way. Start with the whole. Well, if you start with the whole then dominates the parts, and it becomes a false whole, kind of counterfeit whole. What I called in here, it becomes more like a super part that dominates all the other parts. It's a false situation. It's not authentic. Authentic, incidentally, in Greek means self-verifying. It's quite interesting. J.G. Bennett told me that when he told me to do this. Counterfeit and authentic. He said because authentic is self-verifying. Oh, thank you very much. But I now see the point of it. And looking back now, so it was a struggle. It was very, very hard to do this. I found it impossible to do because I was trying to get away from this, particularly this dominance, but without reducing the whole to simply the parts. It was like walking a tightrope. And the easiest thing to do when you're walking a tightrope is to fall off. Fall off on one side, and the whole is reduced to the parts, so you're making the whole up from the parts. That's wrong. Fall off on the other side, and the whole is so totally dominant, it dominates the parts completely, and everything's as it were extinguished by the whole. It's the other side you fall off. So trying to walk on the tightrope to get a dynamical balance between the whole and the parts. And I got it with this formulation, that in fact, that the whole comes to presence within the parts. So it depends on the parts. And the parts themselves can only be parts because of the whole which comes to presence in them. If you work your way into this, and you can do this by thinking your way into it, you can perhaps read the first half dozen pages of this again if you want, probably you don't want, but there you are, up to the section on the... You don't have to go past the section on the wholeness in science, forget that. You just need to go up to the end of the bit on the encountering the whole, and also the whole and the parts and so on and that. And every time I read this through, but I don't very often, I never would. It wasn't I was coming here, and what happens is I've asked the students to do this before they come. So I feel, actually, I better look at it myself, because I'm always ridiculously reluctant to go back to what I've done, which is a thing. And when I look at it this time, because the experience grows, I look and I think, God, I'm astonished at how, even though I say it myself, how much there is in these few pages. In fact, if you were to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pages. If you were to really get into what's in the first 11 pages of that, I could go home. I'm always looking for ways of going home early. It's all right. There just is a lot in it, and more recent work that has happened has made me realise how by accident I latched onto something there that's got much more in it than I realised at the time. And if I do survive finishing this book, and if I continue to live so that the video of me is not needed yet, then I'm going to go back and do some further work on the dynamics of the whole and the part, because I think there's something very further can be done here. But there's enough there anyway. That's that. Now it turns out that some people have actually found this to be useful in just this kind of way, getting beyond the totalism of systems theory by seeing the whole and the part in reciprocal relation. In a number of ways. First of all, I'll just read the next bit because that brings up this as well. Oh yeah. I was surprised when I discovered that this work on the dynamics of the whole and the part, with the distinction between counterfeit and authentic wholeness, has recently been found to be useful in studies of management and organisation. This is me now, not in 1970. The very context in which it arose in the first place. There's a book by Stenger, Sharma, Jaworski and Flowers called Presence, Exploring Profound Change in People, Organisations and Society. Does anyone know his book? People are aware of Sharma, are they? He's charging around all over the place now, isn't he? He's been all over South America, yes, has he? Yes? No? Right. You know him, though, you obviously know. The book, the dynamics of the whole and the part is discussed at the beginning on pages 5 to 7 and then 46 to 49, but it pervades the whole book. And he starts off by saying, everything we have to say in presence starts with understanding the nature of wholes and how parts and wholes are interrelated. And in fact, it turned out that, and then he refers to, the book refers to this stuff I've done, and it's got this stuff, the whole exists through continually manifesting in the parts, and the parts exist as embodiments of the whole, and so on. And it starts off with this, and he quotes, what happened was, I didn't know, Sharma got in touch with me, I didn't know who he was. One morning I got a phone call, Saturday morning, and there's this voice on the phone. It had a German accent, but very American, and it was very, very, it's like he'd come straight down the phone at me. It was in the room, but I can't cope with this kind of thing. I'm English, you know. So he shouted, Henri Bortoft, I was with Henri Bortoft, and I said, he's not here. So he said, who am I speaking to? I said, I'm his brother. And he said, where can I get him? He said, where is he? Where can I get him? This way. And I said, you can't. He's camping. And then he said, which campsite? Give me the address. And I said, no, it's just in the field. Anyway, he said, when's he coming back? And I said, he said, will he be there next week? I said, yes, he'll be back next week. Obviously, couldn't keep him away forever. I'll call again. Same time next week, he calls. And it's him. So then I realised, oh my God, I told him he was my brother. So I can't use the same voice. I know, I do what they do in the films. So I put my handkerchief. And then I realised I got it the wrong way round. Because it should have been my brother's voice with the handkerchief and not my own voice. So it was an absolute mess. Anyway, he went on, he wanted to interview me. I said, well, I don't do interviews, which is true, I don't do interviews. And they'd be asked, well, the reason I don't do it, nobody ever asked to interview me before. So it was easy to say I don't do interviews, because I never had them. So I said, I don't do interviews. And he went on, he wasn't. It's this thing you get from people who've been either American or trained by American. As far as they're concerned, no means yes. And so he persisted, and he was wearing me down. I mean, it was awful. And then he said, I'm coming to England. He said, I thought I could interview you in the Ritz. Now, what he didn't know was that I'd always wanted to have tea in the Ritz. So, whore that I am, I accepted this. And I went to the Ritz. And I never thought about what this interview was going to be about, or anything, because I didn't care. And I went to the Ritz, and it was lovely. The sandwiches were terrible, but the cream cakes were excellent, and they had a fantastic pianist playing that tea time jazz. It was wonderful. So Sean was going on, and I listened to the jazz. Then he wants to talk. And what happened was, you can read the interview. Well, you can read what his version of the interview was, because I wouldn't let him record it, which is stupid of me, because it caused myself a lot of trouble. It's on the internet. My wife discovered it. I don't bother with the internet. She doesn't. Occasionally she Googles Henri Bortoft, and then she says, well, I said, I don't know why bother you living with me, why Google me? But anyway, you know, she does, and she comes up and she says, oh, do you know, so-and-so, and there's things up there with a picture of me and all that. This interview is there. And there are some terrible things in it about quantum physics, which apparently I appear to say that I understand quantum physics, which I couldn't possibly have said, because he started asking me about quantum physics. Well, of course, I wasn't ready for this, because I hadn't thought about quantum physics for years. So I had to say the first thing that came off the top of my head, so I did. And as usual, when that happens, you get into trouble. So there's some nonsense on there. But some people have said there are some other things which are actually quite interesting, so it's there if you want to look at it. Just make sure if you Google it, you get my name right, because otherwise it comes up as somebody else. It was my brother, actually.
I'm still at camping.
Yeah, still camping. Anyway, this happened, and I didn't know this was going to be on the internet, because he sent me through the transcript sometime later, and I was on my way backwards and forwards between Zimbabwe, because my wife was living out there at the time, because the mother was in a terrible state and the mother wouldn't leave. And I'd only got a couple of weeks, and I was going back to Zimbabwe, and suddenly this stuff appears from Sharma. Would I edit it and send it back to him yesterday? Usual American way, I want it back yesterday. So I looked at it and threw my hands up in horror. Oh my God, no, it's terrible, is this? So I did something I've never done before. I thought, I can't, if I start doing this, I'm such a perfectionist, I'll go mad. I'll go to the pub and I'll do it in the pub. I've never done that before, so I went to the pub. And I thought, well, oh, stupid. I thought, I better not start drinking wine because I'll have too much. I know I'll have a whiskey. I can't believe it. So anyway, after 3 whiskeys later, I'm still there. Going through this stuff. But it's all right now because I'm not bothering too much because the whiskey's having an effect. And suddenly a voice says, hello, Henry. And it's a friend who'd just come back from Spain I haven't seen for years. And he's there with his new wife. And they said, we're having a bottle of wine, do you want to join us? Well, we left at closing time with the table covered in bottles. And he said, I've got some pheasants in the oven. Would you like to come and have one? I left his house at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had to send this stuff back to Sharma the following day. So I just shoved it in an envelope and posted it back to MIT without looking at the rest of it. And that is why some of it is such crap, because I never actually did it. Of course, I had no idea that this was eventually going to go on something called the internet and everyone was going to read it. So you have to be careful. Anyway, that's the story about how that happened, but it's not... I tell that because people always assume it's someone like me, and Stefan gives these introductions and they think I'm very this, that and the other and so on. Most of what happens to me is entirely accidental, and most of it was me sort of with one foot in and one foot out, as it were, and so on. The thing's pretty chaotic, and that's how most things happen. Anyway, then he wrote this book, and apparently it was Peter Senger, thought that work on wholeness in that paper was the place to begin it all, and that's how there was such an emphasis there. Sharma is very keen on Goethe because he's an anthroposophist, so he slanted it more towards Goethe, because Steiner, as you know, was a student of... the anthroposophists think they own Goethe because Steiner was involved with Goethe's work and so on. So they think Goethe belongs to them. So they can get Goethe and they feel happy. So it's there. But what he doesn't know, and he never knew, and doesn't to this day, and won't until that's published, that actually the work on the whole and that, I actually also got from Heidegger, not from Goethe, and then I brought it later into Goethe, and actually I got this through working in organizational development, which is in management and organization, and he had no idea, and still doesn't, that that's actually where it came from. So it went back, as it were, to where it came from. And actually there's it's a very interesting book, and there's one bit where he talks later, about page 49, which I would recommend. Well, it's quite interesting. It's called Seeing from Within an Organization, and talks about developing the capacity to see from within the whole, which is exactly, and talks about going into meetings and talking to everybody and finding the whole coming to presence through the people. And this is exactly what we were doing in the Hermeneutic Survey. This was a long time ago. But then I think this is interesting, because when I first came across this, it did give me a shock. Because it's like what you've been doing suddenly comes back to you from the world. And it is a shock. It's like someone's throwing a bucket of water over you. And I remember when I saw, because I didn't know about this. I never know about anything. Again, I discovered the book by accident on the internet, because I was actually looking for Stefan's book. Because I hadn't read Stefan's book, and I was coming down, oh God, I better read Stefan's book. So I go down and I go to the internet, Amazon, and it says, this other book, that's Presence, Sharma. Oh, could that be the Sharma? So I got that. And of course I got such a shock, and it was like a bucket of water being thrown over me, that what I'd been doing came back to me from the world. And I actually said, oh my God, it's real. But I suddenly realised, because got this thing in the world, that what I'd been doing actually was real. And although you believe it's real, you don't really know it until you get the shock that other people find it so, and then you think, then it's real. So I mentioned that because there's this stuff I'm reading to you about now, which I did in the early 70s. Turns out, it's still in its way persisting today. And this stuff on the whole and the part and so on is still going on in the same way. And then, again, by accident, always by accident, last year, I came across another book. Let's read this bit, then we can pack up then and go on. This kind of thinking is also needed in understanding our relationship to the environment. Here again, we must see that the whole is not an object we can stand outside of, but which we are situated within and must learn how to approach accordingly. The need for an holistic ecology has often been noted, but all too frequently, the emphasis on the wholeness of the environment only leads to the counterfeit whole, which is the organized totality of the system. In this case, the natural environment is thought of as if it were an object external to us, instead of the whole within which we find ourselves situated, in such a way that we are woven into the environment as it is folded into us. Ingrid Stefanovich has written a brilliant book in which she shows how it is possible to rethink environmental holism phenomenologically in such a way that any one-sided dependency, whether of the parts on the whole, or, as in the reductionist case, the whole on the parts, simply doesn't arise. She refers to my own work on the relationship between the whole and the parts, and the fundamental distinction between the whole and the totality. And it is clear from what she says that this is as relevant to the way that we think about the environment as it is to our understanding of organizations. I'll talk to you a bit more in a minute. In chapters 4 to 6, pages 51 to 98, Stefanovich gives a beautiful account of the way that phenomenology, quote, offers the possibility of understanding environmental issues holistically in a way that avoids the pitfalls of the usual approach of holism, in quotes. She draws especially on Heidegger in a way that is most enlightening, and which I find especially congenial on account of the influence Heidegger previously had on my own attempt to understand the relationship between the whole and the part. In authentic wholeness, in contrast to the counterfeit wholeness of the system, the whole presences through the parts, so that the part is a place for the presencing of the whole. Stefanovich gives a wonderful illustration of this in terms of Heidegger's ontological ontic distinction based on her own experience of photography. See pages 88 to 9. Well, this was a revelation to me because Ingrid, she calls herself Ingrid, this book is called Safeguarding Our Common Future, Rethinking Sustainable Development. Ingrid Lehman Stefanovich. Well, I hadn't heard of her. She's Canadian, and she's a philosopher, and she taught philosophy for years in the university, perhaps Toronto, I'm not sure. And she really does and can teach Heidegger in a way which shows the students the remarkable relevance of Heidegger's phenomenology of everydayness and also his distinction between his more fundamental ontology. Suddenly words which I know so well have suddenly failed me. What's called the ontological distinction, yes, is relevant, not just for understanding the everyday experience, but also for all these environmental issues. And she suggests that this approach, which she is able to show with her students through years of work, how to get into this and how to see this and how relevant it is, how to begin to understand in this way. It's a wonderful achievement because it's a whole way of thinking. I mean, I can't come along here and just give a talk on it because it's such a whole way of thinking. You actually have to really live your way into it. And then it wakes up and illuminates things. And she starts with, obviously, the Brundtland report, which I've never read, most of you will have done, on sustainability. And, of course, she thinks it's a bit limited, as apparently everyone seems to think it is. And then she goes on to show how the phenomenological approach gives a much better way of doing this. And she's done a lot of her own work. She's got stuff in there with her own work in localities and so on. It's an amazing book. And most exceptionally of all, one part for me. I mean, it's also, she very kindly does refer to my work on this business. She picks up, which was, again, a thrill for me, because there's a lovely section, some arguments against holistic thinking. And I like this very much, because she points out an awful lot of holistic thinking leads to totalitarianism and so on and that. And she wants to get away from that. And how often the systems approach denies the value of the individual component part in favour of some abstract totalitarian vision of the whole and so on and that. Because a great deal of holistic thinking is actually dreadful. It just leads to some form of totalism. And then she does bring up my work and says that emphasizes this point, that in the relationship between the whole and the part, neither is ontologically primary. Which, again, when I read that, I thought that's marvellous. She understood exactly what I was doing. Neither the whole nor the part is ontologically primary. You had this reciprocation and so on. So that's very good. But then later on, I will just mention this because I think this is so wonderful. There's a marvellous section, page 85 to 90, the ontic event and the thing in Heidegger's ontology, where she actually talks about, I mean, she does so much in here, which if you're familiar with Heidegger, it just takes your breath away how she does this in this practical way. But you can do it in the whole and the part. I'll just try and read this bit, because she did. I am reminded of my first experiences in photography when I lived in a particularly beautiful section of Victoria, British Columbia, some years ago. The spectacular houses and gardens of Oak Bay had been part of my everyday world for only a few months, when I resolved one weekend to meander through my neighbourhood, capturing images through the lens of my camera. For the first time, I took note of details of leaded windows, garden fountains and pools, and flowers that were, miraculously, already blooming in February. The experience led me to realize that while the camera focused my attention on specific aspects of my neighbourhood, what made these images special was that they constituted more than an isolated atomistic parcelling up of the neighbourhood through the camera lens. Instead, each image was significant inasmuch as it captured and articulated in a distinctive way the sense of place of the neighbourhood as a whole. On the other hand, I was drawn to notice particular details that I had missed when I had not sought them out through the lens of my camera. That was on the one hand. On the one hand, I was drawn to notice particular details I had missed when I had not sought them out through the lens of my camera. On the other hand, each individual photograph was all the more meaningful to the degree that the broader sense of the place as a whole was reflected and even in some sense enriched in each photographic image. It's a wonderful illustration of the whole coming to presence through the part. And in exactly a kind of situation where we would perhaps superficially say, oh yes, well it's a very analytical device, isn't the camera, just snapping things like that. That's a bit abstract, you're abstracting things, you see, and so on. But then she finds a sense of place as she begins to come to presence through these photographs. So again, that's the whole and the part. The parts allow the whole to come to presence, and the coming to presence of the whole illuminates the parts, so they now become more significant. The reciprocal movement here is beautiful. And she does this in terms of, also, it's wonderful how she does this. I so admire this reciprocity in terms of Heidegger and its distinction between the ontic and the ontological, and how the ontic can become ontological or simply become an object. Now, we don't know that language, so we can't go into that. But if you've studied Heidegger and you see in this simple example, what she illuminates is wonderful. But this is because she's had years and years and years and years of teaching this, trying to bring it out for people and expressing it. And so she approaches the whole question of sustainability and holistic ecology in terms of phenomenology, especially Heidegger. She's a master at it. Now, I did mention this book last year with huge enthusiasm, because again I came across it by accident. Once again I was looking for something on Amazon, and this usual thing comes up. People who bought this also bought this. And the name Stefanovich. I wouldn't have read this, Safeguarding Our Common Future, Sustainable Development. It wouldn't have rung the bell for me. Would for you, but not for me. But the name Stefanovich. And then I realised that when my Wholeness of Nature came out, she did a review of it, in which she said that she really liked the section on phenomenology very much. Well, of course, now when I see what she's like, God, I'm thrilled she liked the section on phenomenology, you know. Now, I mentioned this last year, and Stefan promised to get some copies in the library, so we can say we know those copies are there in the library, don't we?
I'm not sure they are, actually.
No. I bet you've not
Maybe had
done.
trouble getting hold of it.
Yeah. There was trouble. Yeah. Would you like to pick this up again?
Sure.
Because actually, I really do feel very, very sure that the people in this room would get so much from this. And it's actually on exactly the kind of holistic philosophy I'm dealing with. So once again, if they read this, I could go home. That's the point of this. I'm going to have lunch, no man. And what you want is that you've got problems with current thinking about sustainable development. You know all about that. Foundations of phenomenological thought, phenomenological guidelines, sustainability. The whole of the rest of that book, from about page 50 onwards, is absolutely terrific. The first part's on the Brundtland thing, you don't need it. And what she talks about here, this first part of the bit I'm recommending, 51, the possibilities of originative thinking. Originative thinking. Now, what she calls originative thinking is what I'm calling dynamic thinking. And what we're going to do now, I've done this introduction and brought in all these things on the whole and the part, is I'm going to move on. This is a perfect place to stop today, as this whole morning, as you would have realised, has been very, very carefully planned so as to reach this point. That we shut up. We're going to go into this dynamic, what I mean by the dynamics of being. And what I mean by that is what she means by originative thinking, which is thinking from the origin. In effect, we're trying to go more towards the origin. Not quite from the origin, very few people reach that, but we'll see. It's a way of moving more towards the origin and seeing how things come into being. And that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of this week. Aren't you lucky? You mean you're going to stay?
Oh, yeah.
You're going to come again?
Glued to the channel.
Oh dear, looks like I'm going to do some more work.
Can't go home early.
Can't go home early. Oh, no, okay. Yeah, all right. Well, I haven't left much time, but if there's anyone who wants to say anything, or perhaps you're just feeling obliterated. Well, usually I find the question, people say, any questions? I never have any questions. A week later, I'll have a question. But at the time, I don't have questions. And so don't worry if I've got questions, because I've always thought this demand that people must have questions, I think is a bit superficial, because it has to sink in. And it will do without you even thinking about it. And then perhaps tomorrow morning, or whenever, a question arises. That's how it works. It's organic.
I actually have a question now.
Wow!
But it's just a clarification. I just want to make sure. I think that this example that you used, this Stefanovich example about photography and sort of gathering the sense of place, is that sort of what you mean when you say that the wholeness is not physical, it can't be pinpointed, it's sort of like the sense of place?
Yes.
Versus...
Yes. It's a very good example of it, yes.
The active empty.
The active absence.
Active absence.
Yes, actually that's interesting that you said that, because she picks up on this in here, and she actually, she does a quote, she has a quote from the paper, and says, well, this is the act. She doesn't say that in the photography part, which comes later, but she said it earlier, this is the active absence. The whole presences are in the parts, but from the standpoint of the awareness which grasps the external parts, the whole is an absence. But it's an active absence. That's exactly what this is. I mean, that's in this paper here. And she quotes it on page 65, and that applies to photographic page. Thank you for bringing that up, because there's just so much in her work which illuminates this and so on and that I'm actually thrilled by it. I know there was a problem getting hold of this book. I think I was lucky to get a copy of it, but if any way can be found of doing it, it's a sort of book which should be here, and don't want to spend your money for you, but it could stretch to a couple of copies.
I'm wondering if there's alternative formats. Like Kindle and...
We'll sort something out.
Okay, bell's gone. We can go. I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll sort out what we do. What I tend to do is I tend to only do morning sessions, because I get very tired and I sleep in the afternoon, because I can't focus after lunch anyway. But sometimes, to make up for the fact that I've got to earn my money, and I've missed the first session this morning, so I have an extra thing. Sorry, okay. And sometimes I put in an extra afternoon session, sometimes. Just see how it goes. But there's always a problem with afternoon sessions because people have other jobs to do. But I noticed, I looked what I did last year, and last year I sacrificed myself and did a session straight after lunch because people had to do things later. So we'll just have to see. Because you're all involved with cooking and all sorts, aren't you?
Not this sometimes, not this week.
Oh, well, in that case, if you want an afternoon session at 4 o'clock.
Today we've got...
No, not today.
Oh, today.
No. You've got...
Yeah. Let's see. It's definitely a possibility. Yeah.
We'll work it out. I'll see what we need.
Yeah.
Because it's one day today. I've got a lot to do tomorrow. Yeah. Yeah, I might want to do that at just one point. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh.